Hello, welcome to the Fantastic Fiction at KGB reading series. Fantastic Fiction is a monthly speculative fiction reading series held on the third Wednesday of every month, hosted by Ellen Datlow and me, Matthew Kressel. We spotlight well-known and up-and-coming science fiction, fantasy, and horror authors, and admission is always free. We publish a monthly podcast and video so people who can't attend the in-person event can still enjoy the readings. If you'd like to support the series, you can donate at kgbfantasticfiction.org/support. Anyway, on to the show.
How is everyone tonight? All right, we can do better than that. How is everyone tonight? All right, there we go. It's Fantastic Fiction at KGB. I'm Matt Kressel. I co-host the series with Ellen Datlow. We've been doing this for a long time, since the late 90s. It's always free. We never charge a cover. All we ask is that you buy a drink, hard or soft, and tip your bartender, Mary. She's working hard to keep you hydrated. Let's give it a round of applause for Mary. Happy September. Hard to believe that it's almost fall. Isn't that crazy? It's really hot and yeah. Anyway, we have a great lineup for you for the rest of the year. Next month, October 11th, Robert Levy and David Levine. You could clap harder. It's okay. November 8th, Cadwell Turnbull and Victor Manibo. December 13th, Holly Black and S.L. Coney. And next year, January, Eric Schaller and our favorite guest, CBA, thank you. And February 14th, Isabel Yap. And we have other authors lined up, not confirmed. So we hope you will join us for that. I'm excited about our readers tonight. It is their first readings here at the KGB Bar, so welcome to KGB Bar, welcome to Fantastic Fiction. Benjamin Percy and Josh Rountree. Our first reader tonight is Josh Rountree. Josh has published short fiction in a wide variety of magazines and anthologies, including Beneath Ceaseless Skies, The Deadlands, Bourbon Penn, Weird Horror, and Found, an anthology of found footage horror. His latest short story collection is Fantastic Americana, and his novel, The Legend of Charlie Fish, is available now from Tachyon Publications. And before I welcome Josh to the podium, I just want to say that both authors have books for sale. Can I just see a copy of each book? Because I just want to show the beautiful covers. Yes. Josh's book, The Legend of Charlie Fish, is available. So you can come up at the break and get it signed. And The Sky Vault by Benjamin Percy. So let's welcome Josh Rountree.
Take my glasses off so I can read. Thanks to Matt and Ellen for this. This is super cool. I'm going to read a chapter from The Legend of Charlie Fish, and this is pretty early in the book. Really, all you have to know for any kind of setup is this takes place in 1900 in Texas. It's the point of view character is a guy named Floyd Betts who's gone back to his hometown. He lives in Galveston, but he's gone home to bury his estranged father, and he's returning with a couple of orphans that he picked up along the way that were getting mistreated, and so he's taking them back to see if he can help them out. As far as those orphans go, one of them is named Nellie. She's a 12-year-old girl who Floyd is starting to figure out has some witchiness about her. And her brother Hank, and all you need to know about Hank initially is he has a very large pistol that he inherited from his father. So, the children rode cross-legged in the wagon as we headed south. The road traced the same path as the river for a way, and the black line of water appeared in the gaps between the trees. Mosquitoes swarmed, and the humidity was suffocating, even for someone accustomed to Galveston. The children kept quiet for at least 2 hours before Nellie's voice startled me from the lull of travel. "Your house is near the ocean," she said. "Close enough," I said, "a few blocks." "Neither of us have ever seen the ocean." "Well, give it a few days, that's going to change." "Oh, the ocean's beautiful," she said. "Oh, you've seen a picture of it?" Hank spoke up. "No, she ain't. She's just using her whisper talk." "Say again," I said. "Hank, be quiet," said Nellie. Hank ignored his sister. "She's got whispers in her head that tell her things. Like they told her how we should be at that church this morning to make sure you found us. And you did, didn't you?" "That's not how it is at all," Nellie said. "Not most of the time, anyway. Mostly I see things and I feel how things are. It's hard to explain. And sometimes you hear words," said Hank. "Rarely." "Now you're just making up stories," I said. "I don't tell lies, Mr. Betts," said Hank. "Nellie don't neither." Taking the children along with me had been a quick decision, but with enough time behind me to have given it some thought, I realized how ill-equipped I was to provide even the simplest guidance to them. I thought about Mrs. Elder and what she'd think when I came home with 2 orphans in tow. I felt confident she'd help me sort out a solution, but it embarrassed me that I'd need that sort of help. I was a master carpenter. I could build a house without help from anyone. But this whisper talk nonsense was driving home the point that children were complex puzzles not easily solved. I had no business being someone's guardian, and certainly not their father figure. "We won't burden you, Mr. Betts," said Nellie. "I never said you were a burden." "I can tell you're a good man," she said. "You don't have to prove that to us. We're all of us orphans now, so I guess we can be that together. We're all going to be okay, at least mostly. I believe that much for sure." "Well, I'm glad you're optimistic," I said. "Me, I'm just hoping Mrs. Elder doesn't let my room to somebody else before we get back." I knew better than that, and Nellie seemed to know it too. She laughed. "You always have a room at Mrs. Elder's house, I think. What do you know about it?" "Nothing, I guess," she said. "She knows more than she lets on," said Hank. "It's enough to frustrate a person sometimes." "Choose to be kind," Nellie said. "Being spiteful does not become you." With that, Nellie fell quiet. We rode along for several miles, and all the while I could feel her ruminating. That sounds strange, but it was like something was pushing up behind me, scratching at my brain. I could feel Nellie riding in the wagon behind me, quiet as the grave, until the silence seemed to gain a life of its own. The creak of the wagon dulled. The river stopped chirping. The bugs grew still and retreated into the cool shadows. And when Nellie started speaking again, her words tumbled right into my brain. "I know you're lonely for Mrs. Elder, and might be she's the same way for you. I know you didn't like your father much, but you miss your mother dearly, every day. I can feel how much beautiful life there is in Galveston. I can see all the different paint colors on the houses and the way the sun falls and squeezes in between them so that you have to look away or it hurts your eyes. I can feel lace tablecloths and wet sand and fresh sawn lumber against my palms, and I know that life is about to get very hard, but that's nothing new." "Jesus," I said. "I can't tell you much about him." Nellie was out of my head now and speaking aloud. "Where'd you get these books?" I looked over my shoulder, and Hank had the trunk open that I'd brought from home. He was flipping through a copy of Herodotus with narrowed eyes. "Those were my mother's," I said. "We used to read them together." "I love books," Nellie said. "I like stories," Hank said, "just not when they're in books." "The best stories are in books," Nellie said. Nellie dug into the trunk, and soon enough she was reading out loud from A Tale of Two Cities. Hank seemed disinterested at first, but Nellie had read the book before, and when she explained to her brother that there would be people having their heads chopped off with a guillotine, he warmed up to the story. She was a smart child, rarely stumbling over the words, and her soft voice carried us along like a boat on a peaceful river. I was shaken by the power she had to get into my mind, and though by almost any measure it should have been frightening, it was evident there was no darkness in what she could do. She paused in her narration from time to time to show Hank how to sound out words, to point out a tiny copperhead barely visible near the riverbank, to run her fingers through her brother's hair in a vain attempt to comb it down. Her conversation leapt from proper dental hygiene to George Washington to the right way for Hank to fold a handkerchief and stuck it in his shirt pocket, like she needed her brother to know everything under the sun and wasn't sure where to start. Whether or not she understood it herself, Nellie had taken over for her dead mother's role. After a few hours of this, Nellie stopped reading mid-sentence and snapped the book shut. "Somebody is in trouble," she said. "Hank, be alert with your pistol in case it's needed." "Hank, do not draw that pistol," I said. Nellie was up on her knees in the back of the wagon now, trying to look out ahead of us. What passed for a road cut through some low brush and ran close to the river again. There was nothing ahead of us but miles of swampland. "I'm an expert pistolier," Hank said. "Don't worry about me, Mr. Betts." "That doesn't matter. Keep it in the holster." I didn't like the thought of Hank waving that pistol around, taking shots at shadows. He was just as liable to shoot me or one of the horses as whatever he was aiming at, and I was convinced the power in that pistol would put the boy on his behind if he pulled the trigger. Nellie was close behind me now, and I could feel the worry leaking off her. "Do you have a gun, Mr. Betts?" she asked. "I have a rifle with me, in case we want to hunt some supper." "Maybe you should take your rifle in hand." "Nellie, tell me what you're on about." "We're about to encounter some scoundrels." "Say again?" "Some bad men," she said. "My pistol's loaded at least," said Hank. The horses led the wagon around a bend, and we saw another wagon pulled off the road in the trees near the river's edge. It was tall and enclosed with wooden panels that would open up along the side, and the panels were bound shut by what looked like rusted baling wire. Professor Finn's Healing Spirits, Waters, and Mystical Tinctures was painted on the side in sloppy red letters. The wagon looked uncared for. Planks of wood had pulled away in several places, revealing the wagon's dark interior, and the metal tire on one of the wheels was warped. I could envision that tired old wagon moving down the road like a man with a limp, rattling whatever questionable wares were stored inside and shaking her passengers down to their bones. A pair of sorry horses pulled the thing, their ribs like saw blades on the underside of their skin. They lapped at the river and swatted at mosquitoes with their tails. Two men, one of them, presumably Professor Finn, wrestled with something at the water's edge. They looked to have captured a giant fish or maybe an alligator and bound it in ropes, but were having trouble getting the monster out of the water and up the riverbank. The fish thrashed and fought in the shallows as the men struggled against it. "They're hurting him," Nellie said. "They're just fishing," I said. Caught a monster, looks like." "He's not a fish," said Nellie. "Look at him." "He's got a face," said Hank. "Maybe an alligator," I said. "He's a person," Nellie said. "They're going to kill him." Nellie climbed over the side of the wagon and ran toward the commotion. "Get back here," I said. "She ain't listening," Hank said. I set the wagon brake, climbed out, and followed her. Nellie was engaged in a full-throated rebuke of the two men by the time I caught up with her. They had managed to get the fish onto shore, and the larger of the two, a giant who was a foot taller than me and had to weigh over 300 pounds, squatted on top of it in an effort to keep it still, while the second man tightened the ropes around their catch. "Put him back," she yelled. "Let him go. He's not an animal." "Quiet yourself, girl," said the man with the ropes. He wore a long cowhide coat that was far too much for the weather, and a bowler hat that clung tight to his head, no matter how hard he struggled against the fish. He was clean-shaven, but for sideburns that grew to sharp points, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses with one lens missing rested far out on the bridge of his nose. Sweat poured down his face, and he gritted his teeth as he cinched up the last knot binding the still thrashing fish. He stepped back, clapped his hands in satisfaction, and turned to face us. "You're making a terrible racket," he said to Nellie. "Let him go, scoundrels," said Nellie. "I'll do no such thing, and it's no business of yours." "Nellie, come on," I said. "Yes, Nellie," said the man. "Listen to your father." "It's not a fish." Nellie looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "These scoundrels are going to harm him." "You keep calling us scoundrels like you just learned the word," said the man in the bowler. Perhaps you need to broaden your vocabulary. I have an extensive vocabulary, said Nellie. I call you that because it's the name that best suits you. You're an insolent thing. If my daughter was speaking to someone that way, I'd lay a palm up against her face. You do that, you'll find yourself short one hand, I said. The man grinned like he was trying to eat something dead and convince you it tasted good. Forgive my manners, he said. You came upon us during our struggle with this monster of the sea, and my blood is still running hot. I'm Professor Finn. You may have heard of me? I have not, I said. Surprising if you've spent any time in these parts. I spend as little time in these parts as I can. Oh, well, that explains it. My medicines and curiosities are well known. People are positively delighted to see this wagon roll into their town. Toys for the children, healing balms for grandmother's aches, special concoctions for would-be lovers. Arthritis and tuberculosis and fevers, all cured thanks to me. And of course, a few oddities from the four corners of the earth to entice the thrill seekers. Things that can be experienced nowhere else. Have you any interest in seeing a genuine jackalope skull? I can't say that would appeal to me. You're not a professor, said Nellie, and he's not a fish. Young lady, I assure you, I studied at many of the top schools in the eastern part of this great continent, schools where only the finest gentlemen are admitted, places of quiet reflection where the yammering of hard-headed children is forbidden. You are correct, however, that's not a fish. This is one of the wonders of the world. My companion and I have been following stories for years, chasing down false paths. I was not even entirely convinced of his true existence until I laid eyes on the monster myself. But as you can see, he is real. Imagine what someone might pay to see such a creature, and I'm letting you look for free. I finally looked at the struggling fish, and of course it was no fish. It was a man covered in scales, as I've already described him, and when he stared at me, blinked, and bleated like a sheep, I felt my legs nearly buckle underneath me. He doesn't belong to you, Nellie said. What the hell is it? I asked. He does in fact belong to me, Professor Finn said. You have just witnessed the beast's capture. How can you question it? Having been bound tight, the creature had given up most of its fight. It lay there, bleeding. I'd never heard anything more sad or miserable, and when it peered up at me again, I had to look away. The giant who'd been seated on the fish stood, a fat bladed knife as long as my forearm hung in a scabbard on his hip. I remembered Nellie's unheeded warning to have my rifle at the ready. He wore a white shirt, stained from 1,000 dinners, and suspenders with tarnished brass buckles. His pants stopped just below his knees, and he was barefoot. Either he'd lost his shoes in the river mud while he was fighting the fish creature, or he just went around barefooted. A bloated beard hid most of his face, save for a flat nose that looked to have been broken more than once, and eyes that looked right through you. The hair on his head fell in long, greasy strands like the seaweed that washed up on the beach at home. Professor Finn held out a hand toward the giant with a flourish, as if introducing the next act in a traveling circus. My associate, Kentucky Jim. Y'all ain't taking this fish, said Kentucky Jim. Nobody said we were taking anything, I said. Nellie continued shouting. I could feel the wobbly sensation of her mind being put to special use, and I recognized she was using her whisper talk again. Nobody is happy to see you come to town, but they're happy to be shut of you when you leave. I have a better word for you than scoundrel. It's charlatan. You're a thief, stealing people's money and selling them lies. I think maybe you believe half the stories you tell people at this point. Your friend, at least, is an honest liar. He doesn't buy his own tall tales. And this fish man is not going to star in any traveling freak shows, so you can get that out of your head. He is not an animal. He's likely a better person than you are. I suggest you control your daughter, sir, the professor said. Nellie stood close enough to Professor Finn that he could have reached out and grabbed her. She's not my daughter, I said, but we're leaving. I tried to grab Nellie's arm, and she shook me off. You believe my whisper talk? she asked me. I guess I might, but we need to leave these men to their business. Their business is binding the fish man in chains and parading him around to be mocked. They'll beat him for fun, starve him. That big one there is wondering what it would be like to cut off a little piece, a finger maybe, just to see what his color his blood is. The professor grunted, and you could see the mask of civility slowly falling away from his face. My friend can do anything he wants to this beast because he belongs to us. Go back to your wagon and leave, or we may find out what things he wants to do to you. Nellie bolted around Kentucky Jim and began fumbling with one of the knots binding the fish man. Jim grabbed her with no effort at all and tossed her into the river. Well, hell. I came after Jim knowing the outcome in advance, but left with no other options. I aimed my fist at his chin as he turned back to face me, but the blow glanced off him, and he put me down with a punch that felt like a house collapsing around me. On my knees in the river mud, I saw the fish man staring me in the eye. Understanding, intelligence, not an animal. A kick like a shotgun blast to my midsection, and I was down all the way. On my back in the mud with the fish man, the sounds of Nellie screaming, desperate to pull me back from the growing darkness. I remember the promise of Jim's big knife, and I waited for it. Then a gunshot sounded and locked us all in place. Nellie was on top of the fish man trying to untie him. Kentucky Jim loomed over me, knife in hand. The professor was at his side, like he was keenly interested to learn what my insides looked like. And when I turned my head and looked up the riverbank toward my wagon, I saw Hank with that heavy peacemaker pistol in his hand, aimed right at us. His grip was steady. You shot the wagon spoke, Professor Finn said. Busted it in half. Where do you want the next one? Hank asked. Put that pistol down, son, the professor said. Elsewise, we're going to have to kill your daddy. My daddy's already dead. Hank pulled the trigger again, and the bullet went through Kentucky Jim's wrist. He howled and dropped his knife. It stuck in the mud just beside my head. I sat up, trying to shake off the dizziness. Jim and Professor Finn scrambled away, hiding behind their wagon so Hank didn't have a clear shot at them. I pulled the knife from the mud and began sawing through the fish man's ropes. He doesn't belong to you, yelled Professor Finn. Might be you can repair one wheel, but two would be a real chore. Hank shot again, and another wagon wheel splintered. Now that's enough of that. Professor Finn peeked around the edge of the wagon, and I wondered if he might have a gun hidden under his long coat. My brother's a crack shot. Nellie worked to free the fish man as I kept sawing on his ropes. Her grin was so wide, I wonder if maybe she'd lost her mind. I suggest you stay hidden back there until we're far away. If you give him something to shoot at, he won't miss. You're going to die for this, little girl, said Kentucky Jim. You should listen to him, said Finn. Continue with this folly and you'll have forged mortal enemies. This is our livelihood that you're interfering with. Leave now and this will be forgotten. None of us will soon forget this. Hank shot again and clipped the yoke between the two horses. They started and jerked the wagon forward. They splashed into the river, pulling until the wagon became wedged in the mud. The professor and Kentucky Jim scampered to keep the wagon between themselves and the boy. They were like water moccasins seething in the river. We finally freed the fish man from the ropes, and he stood, angry and dripping with muddy river water. I backed away, afraid of what the creature might do now that he was loose, but Nellie grabbed one of his webbed hands with both of hers and shook it, drawing his gaze down in her direction. She smiled, and I could feel that scratchy feeling of Nellie using her whisper talk. Something passed between them, and then the fish man nodded and allowed Nellie to lead him toward our wagon. Come along, she said. We've overstayed our welcome here. Hank, keep that pistol pointed at those two charlatans until we're out of sight. You don't have to tell me that. Hank took another shot, and it splashed in the water near Professor Finn's wagon. You shoot my horses, and you'll be in worse trouble than you are now, said Professor Finn. I wouldn't shoot no horse, said Hank. You come out from hiding, and I'll put one through your neck, though. Nellie climbed into the back of our wagon and invited the fish man to follow. I hurried to catch up with him. Nellie, we can't take him with us. We most certainly can. The fish man hauled himself up into the wagon and squatted next to Nellie, chest heaving. Hank sat beside them, that heavy pistol held steady in the direction of Professor Finn and Kentucky Jim. Nellie hollered at the pair of them, "You two stay right where you are until we're a long way from here, and if we see you in Galveston, my brother won't have any problem resuming his target practice." The fishman started up with that wet bleeding sound, and I figured we'd best get far away before he decided to take some revenge on his captors. I climbed up, took the reins, and hurried the horses back onto the road. The children peppered the fishman with questions, and he continued bleeding as if doing his best to answer. Within a few miles, Nellie had determined that he was a long way from home and that he was in favor of traveling with us all the way to Galveston. Might be the ocean was where he came from originally, but Nellie explained again how the whisper talk wasn't an exact science. Nellie also learned his name, but she said it was not a name that our mouths could pronounce, so she asked the fishman permission to call him Charlie after a cat she'd had that was eaten by an alligator. Charlie agreed. That was fine with him. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really interesting and fun. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, have a drink. Please tip Mary well, come back, and you'll enjoy the second half. See you soon. Hello, welcome back to the second half of our KGB. Thank you. So welcome back. Is it cold in here? It's freezing in here, isn't it? Actually, it's okay. It's our last chance to have air conditioning. In October, we won't need it anymore. Anyway, thanks for coming back. By the way, I just want to remind you that both authors have books for sale, books from which they're reading. So please come and buy their books. They'll sign them for you. They're paperback. They're probably not that expensive. Don't make them go home with them, really. Then they're from out of town. People hate carrying books home with them. At least people who bring books. You can bring one book home with you, that's it. Yeah. All right, anyway. Benjamin Percy is the author of 7 novels, including The Sky Vault, published this fall by William Morrow, 3 story collections, and a book of essays. He writes Wolverine X-Force. Is that one book? Wolverine X-Force? Or is that a second? Oh, sorry about that. 2 different series. Wolverine, X-Force, and Ghost Riders from Marvel Comics. He is a member of the WGA on strike, yeah, and has script and development at Sony, Paramount Plus, and Paramount Pictures. Please welcome Benjamin Percy.
Hey everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. Thanks to Ellen and Matt for hosting me and the KGB Bar, the legendary KGB Bar. I've been wanting to come here for a long time. I get a new haircut every 2 months, and I buy a new shirt every 3 years. It's a low bar, but this is as good as it gets, and it's all for you. So I've written for Marvel or DC Comics for 10 years now. Ellen mentioned how I write Wolverine and Ghost Rider for Marvel presently, and my inner 12-year-old is so happy about this. I love writing comics, but, these characters don't belong to me. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to conceive of the Comet Cycle, these 3 books, is that I wanted my own universe. I wanted my own sandbox to play around in. And so there's this sort of age-old sci-fi premise that's the trigger event for all of these books. A comet comes streaking through the solar system, our planet spins through the debris field, and new elements are introduced to the world. Elements that interrupt the laws of physics and biology and geology. Elements that shake up the geopolitical theater. Elements that, in a very Marvel DC way, introduce a new dawn of heroes and villains. And if you look at the way these books are set up, the Ninth Metal, the Unfamiliar Garden, the Sky Vault, they are not a trilogy. I call them a cycle for a reason. And that one of the things I loved about comics growing up is that if you picked up a Batman, if you picked up Green Lantern, if you picked up Wonder Woman, if you picked up, Superman, these stories were all speaking to each other. That you could read the single titles, but you could also understand them as this larger tapestry, this larger narrative. And in the same way, this is like a bestiary more than a series, more like a family than a series. They're all growing together, and they're all happening simultaneously. So they're standalone books. You can read them in any order. And they sort of break down like this. There's a slippery science that is the foundation of each. So the ninth metal is geology. The unfamiliar garden is biology. The sky vault is quantum physics. And sometimes people say to me, that they'll come up and they'll be like, seems like you know a lot of stuff. And that's actually not true. I read a lot of books about stuff. And I listen to a lot of stuff-filled podcasts. And I interview a lot of folks who have a lot of stuff in their heads, and I take notes. So in this case, everybody is talking about Oppenheimer right now. And everybody knows about the Manhattan Projects. But what this book posits is, what if there was another lab besides Los Alamos? What if there was something else going on at the same time, and they were trying not to split, to crush the atom, but instead to spin the atom or rotate the atom at such a speed that they could create a hole in space-time, which theoretically is possible, and which theoretically MacArthur would find very useful if he wanted to transport, say, his troops from the US to Germany or the South Pacific. Or, roll one of those atomic bombs across the world through a wormhole. And so this is the Alaska Project. I'm going to read two sections, the past and the present. I always try to have a hurdle, a stylistic hurdle for myself for every novel that I write, something that's a challenge for me. And so the way this book works is there is a past, there is a present, and they're both like building towards something cataclysmic together. Logbook, George C. Warnock, entry 14, January 1st, 1943. I'm reading the wrong section. Aha! We're going to go with entry 58 in February 16th, 1944. We didn't know a lot about what was happening in Los Alamos. Not outside of the occasional nugget in the month-old newspapers delivered to our outpost. But one day, when General Tusk was on site, I approached his office to deliver a briefing, and, with my fist ready to rap at the door, I heard Dr. Devenor talking. The floor was the dirty spotted white of an egg, and the door was a cheap pale grain that could not hide their voices. I stood there, but couldn't quite bring myself to knock. Instead, I listened to scraps of their conversation. Dr. Devenor's voice had a depth to it refined by age and cigarettes. It could veer sharply between a bassoon's bellow and a violin's quiver. It was a fine thing to listen to, especially when embellished with the music of his accent. He was in the middle of some heated diatribe that I couldn't quite follow, but it concerned the nature of what we were doing here, the dangerous games we were playing with the world. You think you are gods, he said. Not merciful gods either, but gods of thunder, gods of blood sacrifice. Do you really think history will look kindly on your efforts here? The Major General muttered something in response, and Dr. Devenor's voice rose again as he went off on a wild tear. You don't strike me as a man who reads General Tusk, but you do seem like a man who enjoys the moving pictures. Have you seen the Universal Monsters? You probably see Boris Karloff and refer to him as Frankenstein, like everyone else. That is wrong, of course. if you'd read the novel, you would know better. You would know him as the Creature. But nonetheless, everyone now calls Monster Frankenstein. They call him that even though that is the name of Doctor. Do you know why? It is because you are what you create. There is a lesson here. You are not Major General Ambrose Tusk. No. No, you have a new name. If you continue to carry out this plan of yours, your name is War. I checked the hallway behind me, not wanting to be caught, then bent closer to the door. Now Dr. Devenor was speaking of Los Alamos. Nuclear tests were underway in the Southwest, Utah and Nevada mostly. Sometimes the bombs were buried. Sometimes the bombs were dropped from an aircraft. The seismic shocks could be felt hundreds of miles away. Windows cracked, framed photos fell from walls, porcelain figurines danced off shelves and shattered on the floor. People began to take note of when and where these tests took place. They weren't angry. They were curious and even delighted. It was all in the name of science and the war effort, yes? So the military stopped trying to keep them away and designated areas where people were permitted to watch the tests. Families would picnic and snap photos and applaud when the warheads bloomed in the desert. And then, one blustery day, a 10-kiloton atomic bomb melted the skin off a gathering of 50 people. A downwinder, it was called. The press had not reported on it. The military had so far been able to keep the story quiet. But Dr. Devenor knew, and he was furious. Had they learned nothing? Was the utter failure and disaster that came out of Tunguska not enough of a warning? If the U.S. military was acting this reckless already, then what would they do once they harnessed the power of... It was at this point that the door flew open and I was caught in the light of the office. Dr. Devenor stood there, his hand on the knob, his eyes peeled back white, his mustache bristling. He paused there only a moment before shaking his head and saying with finality, "You are going to make these boys into unwitting murderers." And then he pushed past me. Wherever he went, he left behind the toasty smell of cigarette smoke. "Come in, Warnock," General Tusk said. "Yes, sir," I said, and held up the stiff stack of papers in my hand. "I came to give you the briefing as requested. How much of that did you hear?" I took a seat across from him. His desk was bare except for a coffee cup and a jar of pens. He wasn't present at the facility often enough to put up much of a mark on it, but he had hung up a mounted set of antlers. When I sat, he stood, positioning himself in such a way that the horns seemed to grow out of his head. "I heard nothing, sir." "That is some bullshit. The only thing I understand is that you and the doctor had a professional disagreement. That is a fine pile of bullshit you are serving me right now." He stood there, breathing fiercely through his nose another minute, before telling me to carry on then. He was ready for his briefing, and he hoped like hell I had good progress to share. And that is the past. I used Alaska as my setting for a few different reasons. One is, I've traveled there several times, and I am just completely overwhelmed by it. It is almost too much to take in. The beauty of it, the extremity of it. And so for a long time now, I've been inspired to include in some stories, including one of the audio dramas I wrote, Wolverine the Long Night, including a novella that I wrote that's the back end of one of my collections, Suicide Woods, including this novel. And it's someplace where it feels like you've really reached the end of the map. And in a liminal territory like that, anything is possible. It is the last frontier, in my mind. And according to the license plate. Also, when I've been there before, and this is especially true in Fairbanks, there are all these atmospheric science labs. So you'll be driving around, and this is a hot spot for atmospheric science because of the dark skies, because of the clear air, and you'll see just rising out of a black spruce forest, you'll have, something that looks like it's out of Stranger Things. And so, for that reason, for this reason, and also for the reason that my grandfather was stationed in Alaska during World War II. So he was there in the Aleutian Islands, sitting, on the coastlines with his binoculars out, waiting for an incursion. And when I was there the last time, halibut fishing outside of Seward, when we were out on the boat, we went past this island outpost, and I saw one of those just rotting forts out on the water. And just imagine him there in the spitting cold, staring off into the distance and waiting for something. So all of these things sort of came together to this idea of a secret government lab in Alaska during World War II. And I don't know if you know about this, like some of this is slippery science, as I said, some of it's true and some of it's fabricated, but there's this thing known as the Tunguska event that happened in Russia in 1908. So this plays a role in the novel, and then I was thinking about, okay, if you've got Oppenheimer and you've got Einstein down in Los Alamos, then who do you have up here? Why not Einstein's teacher? Why not one of Einstein's professors? And so I have this guy, Dr. Devenor, who is ripped out of a Russian gulag by the US military and deposited into this lab in Alaska. And he had a role in the Tunguska event. If you don't know about it, it was a 20 megaton blast that is blamed on a meteor, but there was no evidence of a meteor. And it ripped down forests, and it knocked people to their feet, and it broke windows for hundreds of miles around. And so the way I posit it in this alternate history is that this was in fact an atomic event. Early research. And so I have this stage of Alaska, and I also have this wide cast of characters. And I'm going to read from you the story of a woman named Sophie Chen now in the present. She's somebody who rolls into town in a nondescript beige Buick. She goes to a roadside motel and pays in cash. She has a silver armored briefcase with her, and she promptly gets down on her knees and cuts a hole in the box spring and slips it underneath. She's wandering around town and asking a lot of questions. She has many different identifications and many different badges, some of them for the FAA, some of them for the DOT. She collects the black box from an airplane that disappeared for a minute in the skies over Alaska. And she is also following up on everybody on that passenger manifest, trying to figure out exactly what happened. So this will be the last section that I read. Sophie is the vanguard for an operation known as the Collectors. She founded it soon after Skyfall, when the meteors changed the geopolitical reality of the world. Her first recruit was a German, a KSK soldier named Hans Mueller, who had been a whistleblower on the far-right beliefs expressed by many in the Special Forces. After he went to the press, he faced scathing denials from high-ranking officials. His apartment caught on fire, and several videos of him engaged in sex with other men were released online. She found Hans alone, drunk in a bar in Munich, and she slid into the booth beside him. "I have a proposition for you," she said. And he stared at her blearily for a moment before saying, "You're not my type, Fraulein." And she said, "As a matter of fact, I am." One by one, they grew their operation. Their recruits were ex-military, mostly some CIA and CVR and MI5, a few hackers, one failed Vegas magician, mercenaries. Together they formed a kind of orphan family. They study the feeds, they study maps, they pay for tips from reporters and politicians and military insiders. They run surveillance on phones, security cameras, satellites, social media. They run predictive algorithms and consult psychics and numerologists and metal eaters. They put the data into action. They dive into deep-sea trenches. They canoe and bushwhack the Amazon. They snowmobile to Siberian outposts. They drive ATVs into the Sahara, and they climb the Dolomites, and they spelunk in the New York City subways. They chase leads, and they collect. Even before the comet, a meteorite could be worth $1,000 per gram. Omnimetal is an even richer strike. They don't feel allegiance to any country. They are loyal only to themselves. They don't care about politics. They only want money. Their work is too risky for a permanent address, so when they aren't in the field, they generally stay on a boat, a metal shark Defiant 165 that cuts through international waters. They have safe houses and storage bunkers throughout the world containing their finds. They have samples of the alien fungus that grips Seattle. They have an herbal accelerant that seems to speed up both cellular growth and time itself. They have ice that freezes at 70 degrees. They have a man who can seemingly control flora, and a boy with omnimetal impossibly woven into his skin. The archive of their auction items is long. But Sophie is here in Alaska for something else. Something incalculably valuable. She has a list of 152 people. That's how many are on the passenger manifest of the 737 that flew from PDX to FAI. She crosses them off name by name. More than half came here for tourism or business. Some rented cars to visit Denali. Some transferred to single-engine plane to Barrow. Some have already finished their business in Fairbanks and returned home. And the rest live in the city, or within a 100-mile radius. She rings bells and knocks on doors. Sometimes a dog barks. She waits for the doorknob to rattle, the shades to be drawn aside. She arranges her face into a smile. She presents her badge and introduces herself as an investigator. At first they think that they've done something wrong, that they're in trouble, but she assures them that no, that's not it at all. They're good. She's simply following up on the in-flight disturbance they unfortunately experienced. She is gathering witness testimony as the DOT decides which charges to file and determines whether the crew followed protocol. Oh, and she's happy to report that the airline will be giving everyone 1,000 bonus miles as an apology and a thank you for their willingness to participate in the investigation. Some people speak to her through a crack in the door, but most invite her inside, apologizing for the mess. She sits on couches in a lazy boy recliner in a living room and on wooden chairs at kitchen tables or bar stools on granite islands. She pretends to drink the coffee and water they offer her. The walls are pine-paneled or sheeted with bear-patterned wallpaper. There are lacquered fish and mounted antlers and family photos and football trophies and crosses and wooden signs that say live, laugh, love. The carpets are brown and the floors are salt-stained hardwood. Sinks are stacked with dirty dishes, buzz with the last flies of the year. TVs play constantly in the background on mute. Babies cry, dogs eye her suspiciously. Phones ring, but please, she says, she only needs a minute of their time. She takes notes on a legal tablet that she pulls from a portfolio that carries the DOT emblem. Do you mind if I smoke? Some say, as if this were her house. And no, of course she doesn't mind, as long as they keep talking through the clouds of menthol. Tell me what happened, she says, on Delta Flight 3469. One man, Josh Kazara, lives in a trailer with 4 other men. They're members of a construction team working on a pipeline. His knuckles are stained with grease. He wears a Colorado Rockies ball cap that's so filthy she can't be sure of its original color. On the flight, he was watching a movie, a really good movie, one of those action movies starring The Rock. He can't remember the name of the movie, but there were at least 4 helicopter explosions, and it was awesome. She should totally watch it. But yeah, sorry, he's got nothing. The movie screen, it kept glitching towards the end of the flight. Maybe 20 minutes before they landed, maybe 10. The screen glitched and it went dark, and he was like, fuck! The sound got all weird, like The Rock was whispering something to him. But then he poked and he punched the controls a few times, and it was all good. Honestly, whatever was going on, that dude who was going crazy or whatever on the plane, Josh didn't even realize anything had happened until the cops boarded the plane and dragged him away. Corey Smith works in insurance and lives in a colonial home in a development called Polar Heights outside the city. Soft rock plays from built-in speakers while they talk. He wears a collared shirt under a gray knit sweater. He says that yes, he was aware of the passenger causing a scene. He was a rangy man with a big beard and a corduroy jacket and a Hawaiian shirt. He remembers the man running down the aisle. At first, Corey assumed the guy had to use the restroom, but then he began shouting about the clouds, something crazy like that. He pounded on the door of the cockpit, and that is when several people unclipped their seatbelts and charged forward and brought the man to the floor. Here, Corey says, I think I've got something. And he digs out his phone, and he swipes through his photo album until he comes to the shaky video. I was a little slow on the draw, but I got the end of it, just to give you like a vibe. The video is seemingly worthless at first glance, shot from 20 rows back, jerky, unfocused, seat backs, heads, glimpses of what's going on at the front of the airplane where a small crowd has gathered and a desperate voice can be heard bellowing. Do you mind if I take another look at that? Sophie says. And Corey says, knock yourself out. And she takes the phone and toggles the video slider. Here's a glitch, a glitch, a glitch. Second long breaks in the footage where everything goes grainy black. Her hands move without pause as she flicks her finger and thumb outward, zooming in, finding a cabin window. She edits, clarifies, changes the color gradient, screen grabs a shot of the sky outside, where the clouds appear to be sculpted into monsters. What is it? Corey says, leaning in. She uploads the video onto her own device before deleting it from his. That, she says, is evidence. Thank you. Thank you, too, to Ellen and Matt and the KGB Bar and all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you. So come on and buy some books. Come on, if you find out what happened. And also have a drink. Come on, relax, hang out. See you next month.
You have been listening to the Fantastic Fiction at KGB reading series. Check out our website at kgbfantasticfiction.org and click on support if you'd like to help keep the series going. Anyway, that's our show. Thanks for listening, and see you next month.